Welcome to Cynical Celluloid, the place where a meagre budget goes a very long way. This episode, we're visiting an ultra-low budget oddity that goes to some familiar places, as gigantic monsters and ancient evil threatens to take over the world of the living. It's stop-motion goodness aplenty and evil coming at you in Jack Wood's Equinox. A man, David Feeling, is run down by an apparently runaway car. A year later, a journalist follows up on the story and David isn't doing well. Being unresponsive to most tests and treatment, he's obsessing about a cross that he has. As the journalist tries to interview him, David freaks out and attacks him, triggered by a photo clearly of someone that he knows, and he has a flashback. During the struggle, the journalist ends up with David's cross and he and the doctor review the early sessions, which begin to reveal his story. The story that led up to him being run down. It turns out they'd gone out to see a Dr. Waterman and they found themselves in a very remote location, and they weren't alone. Heading towards the cabin, they found it badly damaged and were confronted by a ranger, Asmodeus, who seems to be keeping a close eye on them. But along the way, when they hear a creepy laugh coming from a cave, they decided to investigate. On approaching the cave, one of the girls found unusual footprints in the dirt leading towards it and a decomposed body inside, along with a very strange old man, the source of the noises that they heard. The old man passed them a book, and it's a book that had all manner of strange and ancient writings within it, and when they investigated, things got very weird. And unfortunately for them, the book seems to be sought after by some very dangerous beings, including the ranger that they met earlier, who begins to set evil creatures on the group in order to get his hands on the book. Chased by all manner of beings, the group eventually started to fall possessed and turned against their friends or killed by the monstrous creatures. And with David as the only apparent survivor, the circle is apparently complete. Only he's about to get a visitor. Will Asmodeus' promise finally be kept?
Come on. Here it is. The book. The real book. Now it's your book. Take it.
Don't you want it back?
Equinox is pretty much everything I love about low-budget filmmaking. I know, spoiler alert, but this film pretty much is the textbook for making a film on nearly no budget. Made in the late 60s for an apparent $6,500, which was a meagre sum even for the time, this is some astonishingly slick filmmaking. It should be pointed out that the IMDb page states $65,000, but that seems unlikely. I know, IMDb being wrong, surely not. For context, Manos is reported to have cost $19,000, 3 times as much, and it's a terrible movie. Equinox follows what turns out to be a now familiar tale. A group of teens, apparently in their mid to late 20s at least, go out into a remote area looking for a cabin and happen across a book that contains forbidden knowledge that can unlock evil. Along the way, they're attacked by monsters and are even possessed, as one by one they fall to the big bad. Yeah, Evil Dead isn't quite as ferociously original as Stephen King stated, but that's certainly not intended to take a damn thing away from that wonderful movie. To be fair, he did say film of 1982 in that quote, so he does have something of an out there. And there is some anecdotal evidence that Raimi et al. Had actually seen Equinox. Not that that's a bad thing. Inspiration drawn from other works is a staple of art as a matter of course. Standing on the shoulders of giants and all that, and indeed Equinox does its fair share of drawing from other works as well. Most notably the work of Ray Harryhausen. Harryhausen was reportedly very impressed by the stop-motion work. It should be noted also that there are actually 2 versions of this film, the original version and the version that we're looking at here. The original version was put together by filmmaker students and director Dennis Moran as a short film entitled The Equinox, A Journey into the Supernatural, and that ran at about an hour and 11 minutes. It was picked up by distributor Jack Harris, and extra footage, some 11 minutes or so, was shot by Woods to fill it out and make it run more coherently, with apparently the evil character Asmodeus being added to help clarify what was going on. If I can get hold of the Criterion Collection release, then I may well do a comparative essay on the two different versions, but for now, let's go back to the film in question. The story is a pretty undemanding affair. Young folk go into the woods and find an ancient evil. It borrows bits and pieces from Lovecraft with a smattering of sci-fi and alternate dimensions and the likes, and a Harryhausen-inspired dose of monster movie madness that takes a trip into the Jason and the Argonauts kind of territory. It's a dizzyingly hedonistic indulgence on the filmmaker's behalf, but one that screams enthusiasm rather than lack of imagination. After all, there's plenty here to suggest that the project was just as much about passion as it was any kind of commercial concerns. When it comes to the story, it's a bit slow and meandering, and it's certainly not the most exciting story out there, but it does do its best to really fill out the mythology, though it does suffer a bit in the pacing issues. This isn't uncommon for a film of this nature, where there's something of a need to stretch out from a fairly thin story to a full-length feature. A lack of funds and resource can impact the more spectacular scenes or the inclusion of action, and in its stead, well, you get a lot more talking. There is a bit of tension bubbling under the surface, but it's all too often broken by the extensive telling rather than showing. That said, the action scenes are about as spectacular as you can get in a film with near zero budget. It's probably even better so. Giant monsters are brought to life through animation and other techniques such as forced perspective. Strange phenomena are crafted through mirrors and optical effects, and all this at a time when the filmmakers didn't have access to the kind of tools you can even get on a smartphone these days. The sheer beauty of the filmmaking here, the ingenuity, the inventiveness, and the amazing amount of imagination and effort that went into the special effects really should be studied and appreciated by anybody who wants to make films, and absolutely should be admired by anyone who considers themselves a fan of film. Yes, many films have done it better then and since then, but not many did it with as little in the way of resources. Filmed with a silent camera, like Manos the Hands of Fates was, the film was dubbed in post and typically sounds a bit odd for it. There's a strange detachment from the physical performances, including some scenes where the words don't match their mouths at all, but let's face it, for us hardened exploitation fans, this ain't going to be that big a deal. It's business as usual, though you'll find yourself wondering what the actual words were. Also, like Manos, the camera was only capable of shooting some 30 seconds at a time, it seems, and frankly, the end result really does stand testament to the fact that you can work within these limitations if you're a competent filmmaker. And then there's shots like this. Which is notable. And in case you're wondering, it doesn't look any better in a girl-on-girl version.
Susan Beckett, what?
Suffice to say, this film is quite amusingly odd at points and just naive enough to raise a smile without having the kind of cynicism that deliberately bad films do. I can absolutely see why some would look at this and laugh at how off it looks on occasions, how low budget and silly it can be. But despite the rough edges and by today's standards and how relatively low energy the action scenes may be, it does keep things moving at a reasonable pace, and even when the commercial for Kentucky Fried Chicken comes along, it's a hugely amusing stall in the progress.
I'll have you know my chicken is of world renown. Voila!
Saved by the Colonel.
For those not in the know, Colonel Sanders was actually a surprisingly prolific supporter of independent filmmakers. He even pops up in person in some films. It's always a bit distracting, but it's kind of one of those really amusing what the fuck moments. When it comes to the story, aside from being a bit bare bones, it has to be said there are a few things that just don't pan out. The castle is nearly pointless, the old man in the cave is a contrivance, and the teen's reaction to him is, well, odd to say the least. Also, certain elements of the plot don't make all the sense in the world, but these are things that are pretty forgivable. Most of these things don't get in the way of the main thrust of the movie though, so fudgy as they may be, though not to the extent of causing real problems. It at worst feels a little tacked in there on occasions. Certainly Asmodeus' presence as he pops in and out of the story can feel more functional than artistic in its purpose, which is understandable given the history of the film's development from amateur project to professionally released movie. Further to this, it does feel like the extension of the film was as much about being a more respectable feature length to some degree, though that's not all the final director's fault. It's only fair to acknowledge the film is a bit underexplored in its concept, with plenty of ideas like the castle only being touched on lightly. Asmodeus also being little more than a plot driver instead of an interesting character that he could have been, and there was very little reason for the main characters to actually do anything except for run, which they seem very reluctant to do on a number of occasions for less than satisfying reasons. It's far from perfect in these regards, of course it is, but the central idea holding the story up is quite nicely done, and there's enough action to make the film memorable for more good reasons than the bad ones. I've written more words than I care to remember about the nature of filmmaking and how budgets can make or break a film, but it's not in the way that you think always. We live in a world where so much can be achieved with digital effects that all too often introduce a level of overindulgence, and it's a problem. Just look at the likes of Transformers, or even the film I reviewed recently for Frankly Green Bay, the almost universally lauded A Quiet Place, where the entire film was torn to the ground for me by the final reveal of the creature. In that latter example, the creature was an overblown, excessively designed mess that was allowed to exist because of the possibilities that digital effects provide. Equinox also contains some outlandish creatures, true, but it's all restrained to a degree by the technology that these filmmakers had. They're not intrusive, they're part of this weird fantasy world and are detailed to an appropriate level for that world. I can accept it because this film had no other way to achieve some of this stuff, and the monsters, though outlandish, are handcrafted and ingeniously created, and don't look out of place or overindulged in their design. The same criticisms can be made of the low-budget 2010 film Skyline. It was a film that simply didn't know where to stop because the tools were there to create anything that the filmmakers wanted. There were a lot of great ideas in that film and a lot of tension, but all of that was destroyed by the lack of practical barriers that actually allowed indulgence to ruin it. Equinox, for all its faults, had to fight and think its way around problems. Evil Dead had to fight and think around its problems. Jaws, the same. Problems and challenges are what often make a film a triumph, not taking the easy way out, and Equinox certainly faced its challenges and came out the other side as a thoroughly charming and entertaining jerky beast. You can feel the effort in this film, you can feel the passion in it. To some extent, I have to admit this is like comparing apples to oranges. After all, the films I mention have very different tones, but it has to be said the achievements of the monster effects in this film far outstrip that of many a movie made these days, even if they do look a bit clunky by today's standards. If you want to see a near-perfect demonstration of practical filmmaking, then look no further than the outstanding use of forced perspective here. And the amazing use of mirrors and optical trickery here.
Is it? Hold it. Can you see it?
See what? What are you talking about?
Wait, I'll show you. Watch this.
Watch what? What in the... I can see it now. Dr. Waterman's notes.
It's inspirational and it's frankly genius. A practical, cheap, inventive way to make an idea happen on screen. Overall though, I have to say that Equinox is a rather pure piece of hokum. It's made with a high degree of enthusiasm and no little amount of ingenuity and inventiveness. I can hardly claim it's a lofty film in terms of the story. Quite frankly, the story is about as rudimentary as it gets in most respects. But it is fun, and it's ambitious enough to make the meandering through this strange little world that they created a hell of a lot of fun, or at least an endearing experience. And given its apparent influence, it's worth checking out to see the kind of films that influenced some of the major directors since then.